Hello, this is A Conversation with the Blues, a podcast with your host here, Michael Roach, and Dr. Christian O'Connell. We are trustees for the European Blues Association, who is the organization behind the podcast, and we're here to talk about Paul Oliver's 1960 field trip when he went to the United States for the first time, interviewed blues singers, and he talked about the cultural conditions under which the blues was born. And when I came to Britain in 1995, I met Paul, and we struck up a friendship. We stayed in touch with each other, and I approached him one day to ask, I said, Paul, what's going to happen to your life's work? And he said, I haven't thought about it. And then I proposed that we set up an organization so that we could, as the Conversation with the Blues book says, and he signed my edition, he says, the conversation continues. And that's what we did. We became a registered charity, and that was in 2002. And the board recently decided that we should perhaps do a bit more to let people know that Paul's life's work, his collection, is stored and housed at Oxford Brookes University. It's been cataloged, fully digitized, and Christian was involved in that. He's a professor at University of Gloucestershire.
That's right.
And you also wrote a book on Paul's life's work, about Paul and his life's work.
That's right, I did, yeah. Although I'm not quite a professor yet, unfortunately. Maybe one day, I don't know.
But why don't you tell us about the trip, Paul's trip in 1960, because you did a lot of research on that.
I did, yeah. So people listening to this podcast will probably be familiar with Paul Oliver's work as one of the most prolific scholars and researchers, documenters of blues music from the 1950s and 60s onwards. And this was his first trip across the United States to record and interview singers, find out about the music, where it came from, the land where the blues began, as Alan Lomax's famous book is called. And I think this is important for many reasons, not only because of the publication that comes out of it, but because of Paul's role in blues scholarship. He's considered by many to have really shaped our understanding of the music, really bringing to light a lot of knowledge about the singers, the social cultural context, as you mentioned, about where it came from. What the lyrics meant, and how the music was part of a much richer tapestry of music in African American and American culture, particularly from the American South. What's interesting, as you mentioned, about this trip is that he'd never been to the United States before. However, he'd been writing about the music for quite a few years already. So Oliver was part of a group of jazz researchers, journalists who wrote in magazines like Jazz Journal and Music Mirror in the 1950s in Britain. In fact, his first encounter with African American music, interestingly, was during the Second World War. As a teenager, he writes that he heard GIs, African American GIs, working in a field in Suffolk, and they were singing while they were working, and he described it as the strangest music he'd ever heard. There's a bit of a parallel with W.C. Handy there in Tutwiler, that story, a little bit that always struck me. But so he'd been writing articles, interpreting records that he would find and collect, and this was a very niche thing. There's a very nice photograph, actually, of from Paul Oliver's apartment in London in 1957, in which you get a real, and we used this on the cover of a book called Transatlantic Roots Music a few years ago, where you see in his apartment, Oliver takes a photograph of Big Bill Broonzy, who was among some of the first visiting musicians to Britain, blues musicians in that period. Brother John Sellers, alongside people like Alexis Corner, Beryl Bryden, and his wife Valerie, who accompanied him on this trip, and I believe you met and knew quite well. knew quite well, Michael.
Yeah, very well, yes.
So when he went on this trip, he'd studied the music quite closely through records, and that led to his first major book, Blues Fell This Morning, which was an analysis of about 350 or more songs and their lyrics. And he was known for interpreting this music very closely, and he wasn't the only one, but many believed that the blues singer was the spokesperson for the African American community, and he was very careful to try and tie or interpret the lyrics in a way that told people about the African American experience. And it was often a story of hardship, struggle, poverty, the lives of sharecroppers, or in the American South, or people who kind of worked hard for a living, and the blues was a means of escape and for some a means of a living as well. And he wanted to go and see this world for himself. He'd heard people like Brunsey and other people who'd visited from the US tell him where the music came from, but this was his opportunity to really compare what he thought with the reality. And I believe he says, I was anxious to meet unknown singers, to find the people who had not really known the recording studio. He was very interested in the music as a folk culture, not necessarily as a pop music, as some may have interpreted the blues in the 20s and 30s.
That's a good point, because in his 1960, let me add one thing. He published a book on Bessie Smith.
That's right, in 1958. That's right. So that was his first kind of pamphlet or booklet on.
Yeah, before Blues Fell This Morning.
That's right. Yeah.
And in the preface to the 1990 revised edition to Blues Fell This Morning, he wrote that he specifically said the intention of writing the book was to show a thematic content of the blues related to many aspects of the black experience, particularly for the period that we're talking about.
Yeah.
That was in 1960, because we have to keep everything in context.
Absolutely.
Because the language was even different now.
Yeah.
Especially when you think of today, we got texting,
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So it's interesting when you make these parallels when you talk about this Englishman going to America for the first time, interviewing these unknown and known people.
Yeah. Because
he did interview, John Lee Hooker and
right.
And Lightning Hopkins and J.B. Lenoir. They were known.
So there's a mixture of people who were quite successful recording wise, and others who were less known.
Yeah.
Like Mance Lipscomb, for instance. But yeah, that's it. And I think you told me once that he told you about the trip, that he was worried that what he'd written about in Blues Fell This Morning might not turn out to be true when he went there. Is that right?
And then he wrote to say that it was more than accurate. And knowing the way that Paul writes, it was just an exaggerated way of saying this really was on point. Mm-hmm. Because he wasn't sure, because he'd never been before. Richard Wright, amongst others, was telling him that he should go. And then when he goes, whoa, it's not just right, it is right on point.
What really comes when I remember analysing and studying his work, that he really wanted that social cultural context, the real lived experience of people, which he saw as essential and part and parcel of the music, to really come forth. And I think this was part of his desire here to really see the world in which that music existed and where it had come from. And importantly, and I think we'll talk about this, as you've picked out a few of the interviews and a few of the samples to discuss, is that he really wanted, after he'd spent so much analysing the lyrics and talking about them, he wanted the music and the singers to talk for themselves, to give their kind of an interpretation of what this music was, where it came from. And it was really about that, I think. The main point of this was letting the music and the singers, the musicians, speak for themselves with as little interference as possible.
Yeah, that's so true, because he also wrote here that with all these factors in mind, it's still my opinion that commercially recorded 78s made between the 1920s and the mid-1950s give us the most accurate picture we are likely to have of the blues when it was solely the music of the black community.
That's
And
that's and that, you know, in Bluesfell this morning, he said that this was he used another word of the time, but he said this was the African American world, and there was a line that he often used, that the music was more authentic where white influence was lowest.
that's a good way of putting it.
Which is not a million miles away, really, if we think about, you know, this is music from the era of segregation, but also Paul visited the USA in 1960 in a very sensitive time, in the summer as well of 1960, traveling from north to south, you know, a very, very kind of particular time where, you know, segregation was also being challenged quite overtly.
Very overtly.
Yeah.
So much so that he was talking about the experience of how he had his wife with him, Valerie, and Valerie's presence was very kind of touchy because, again, she was a white woman in the presence of these black guys, and everybody like, what is she doing here? What's going on?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and Paul said that because she was with him, that made the black musicians, the artists, the people that he were interviewing and talking to, relax a bit more because they thought that he was okay. I mean, why would this guy bring his wife with him if he wasn't sincere? Expose her to danger.
Yeah, and there was also that factor that she was. I mean, I think it's very good to talk about his wife Valerie, because she was always kind of there and very supportive of the work he did, from what I understand. And then she was also very good at making. One of the things about interviewing people is making those people feel comfortable, and, you know, they let their guard down and perhaps a little bit and open up a bit more. And he kind of suggested that she was very good at creating that situation. But also, you know, the fact again that he said that, you know, often when people would hear his accent, they would suddenly drop their guard. You know.
Can you say that again?
Did he tell you about that?
Yeah, he often talked. Well, I experienced it myself when I met my English girlfriend in Washington, D.C., which is now my wife. And now my children, when they go and visit their cousins and relatives back in Washington, D.C., where I'm from, that's the first thing they say. Can you say that again? Because they like the accent, because it is different. It's a different way of speaking.
You know, I think that shows, I mean, how important it is to be able to establish a rapport with someone in order to interview them. And I think that's what comes forward from this, is that even in the 50s, obviously, Oliver hosted people like Big Bill Brunsey and some of these singers, and he established, I mean, I remember him showing me Brunsey's signed copy of his autobiography, which was kind of a big moment for me when I first saw that. This is the closest I'm ever going to get to Brunsey. But I think that's that comes forward in the book. I think that he was able to interview these people and cross these cultural barriers, perhaps, that were tricky. They weren't. This is not a straightforward thing, you know.
No. It's interesting that you said it because, you know, Brunsey visited while it was Valerie's birthday, and he cooked for Valerie.
That's right. I think I remember him.
But they can't recall when I asked. I said, "Well, what did he cook?" He said, "He was a great chef." And I'm like, "Big Bill Brunsey, wow!" But they couldn't recall what he had cooked.
Right. Really fascinating as well. But you picked. You thought that there were a couple of. I mean, there's interviews with over 65 singers in this book, and the CD and the record that accompanied it, and you picked out a couple to talk about.
Yes. Also, in the first edition here, it says with 80 photographs. Mm. But I love the later edition with blind Arvella Gray on the front cover. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. But I wanted to just touch base on something, because, again, I always want to relate and keep everything in the social context, because that's where Paul was coming from. Mm-hmm. Because you can't have the blues without the social context.
No.
And I remind people constantly that when you talk about black history and black people, our history didn't start with slavery, because we always had presence in Europe. There was presence in royal families all throughout the centuries. And let alone Africa. And so, but we always had a seat at the table, put it that way. But then in the American context, we went from exclusion to segregation, discrimination. And you made a great point. You were saying about how poverty leads to creativity.
Yeah, so some of the reviewers, when they saw the book when it came out, were very like, this is an immersion into the social cultural reality of where this music comes from. And they were, I think there was a quote that poverty, it's a sign that poverty always breeds a need for cultural expression.
Very well put.
And I think that's really what Oliver was really keen to demonstrate, the kind of world, the realities, the harsh realities of the world in which the music, and it comes forward in the interviews as well as in the images, which we can talk about in a bit.
Yeah, and before he died, he published a book called Barrel House Blues. And in Barrel House Blues, it was based on a recording by a guy named Ed Andrews. It was the same session that OK Records recorded Fiddlin' John Carson. Fiddlin' John Carson was known to play at Ku Klux Klan rallies throughout Georgia. And he was saying he would love to be been a fly on the wall to see if Ed Andrews was sitting outside the studio waiting for his turn to go in after Fiddlin' John Carson did his recording session, and he would have loved to seen his face when he came out. And I feel the same way when I think of Paul in the interviews. I'm saying to myself, I would love to see Paul's face when he went and interviewed guys in Detroit, Texas, and Mississippi. And let's start with a recording from Boogie Woogie Red, a guy that he recorded in Detroit. And for a lot of people that don't know much about the blues, let Red tell you about the blues here.
Well, I'll tell you about the blues. The blues is something that you play when you're in a low mood or something, and the hardships that you have had through life. It's just a mood that you are in. But the average person take blues as what you might call a plaything, but blues is really serious. Blues is something that you have to play coming from your heart. And blues have been going on for the centuries and centuries. And blues was written in years and centuries ago, and they will always last. Say, for instance, you'd be lonely, and your girlfriend or your wife, you'd be in a melancholy mood or something. Well, you just want to hear some blues. Then you just go in and relax your nerves. Blues is something that relaxes your nerves. Take a man, he have been prosperous, making lots of money. Well, I mean, when his money's all gone, what else is left but the blues? So he just sit around and listen to the blues. But there's so much good feeling in the blues. That's the main thing about the blues.
So this recording is an example of actually how, like, Oliver was interested in the singers telling people what the blues was. He didn't want to tell people what the blues was. He wanted the singers, the people he interviewed, to explain what it meant to them. And there's often different stories, but that's what Boogie Red doing there. It shows how Oliver was interested in the music speaking for itself.
That's why if you listen to the recording that came with the book, and in the reissue, there's a CD that came with it as well. So here's a copy of the CD in the back. If I take off the cover, you can see it says Conversation with the Blues. So but in the original format, it came with an LP. And there's a blind Arvella Graham. I'm going to put that up here like that because he's next. I find him really interesting, this guy, because when we're looking at the social context, because you got to remember that from 1910 to like 1970, it was estimated around 6 million African Americans migrated from the South up into the industrial North. Yeah. And in the 1920s alone, it was around 800,000 to 1 million. And they went for a better life, for the opportunities that they had up there, and the jobs were paying more than what they were getting when they were down in the agricultural South, working down there as well. And in fact, when I became interested in the blues myself in the early 80s, my parents, who were born my mother was born 1915, she said to me, I don't know why you playing that music. That's why I left the South, because my folks from South Carolina. She was born in South Carolina. She said, that's why I left there. I don't know what you doing. And so it's really interesting when you look at these kind of cultural contexts to come with it. And a lot of the places these guys played in, there were sawmills, turpentine camps, lumber yards, tobacco warehouses, and barrel houses and juke joints. And they call them barrel houses because they just put like 4 barrels in a row, and they put like a plank of wood on top. And that's where the word barrel house, and that's where that came from. Mm-hmm. And that was like the sporting life joints where, you know, a lot of unfortunate, very violent behavior used to take place, especially when it comes to some female or somebody stepping on somebody's foot or some silly thing. Yeah. But, you know, growing up, I have to admit, every Sunday, you go to Sunday school on Saturdays, or you go Sunday morning before the main service, but always church on Sunday. But you walk past the beer garden, the nightclub joints, and it was always glass and blood on the sidewalk, because in black society, as a boy growing up, I was born in 55, as a boy growing up, work hard all week, party on Friday and Saturday, raise hell, fuss and fight, and you go to church on Sunday and ask for forgiveness.
I suppose that's what comes out in some of the interviews, isn't it?
That's exactly. So let's play an interview with no, I was going to start with him. Instead of starting with him, let's start with a trumpet player. It's really interesting. Charles Love. He was from Louisiana, and he played with the minstrel groups, and he traveled around, and I love his take on the blues. Before we go into Blind Arvella Gray in Maxwell Street, but this is Algiers, Louisiana, Charles Love. I'll make sure that's right.
What do you think about the blues?
Well, I tell you, I don't like the blues myself, but I can play them. I always did play them. You see, the blues is nothing but the evil of music, you know, evil spirit of music. Why I say that, you know, everywhere the blues is played, it's be a fight right after. When people hear that, they get all bewildered some kind of way, you know, makes them wild. They want to fight, want to dance and fight and everything. I never did like blues, but I noticed that everywhere we played and started playing the blues, the dances be all right up till they put the blues on. When the blues start the blues, it breaks up the dance in some places. I played in Little Rock, Arkansas one night. They had a very good orchestra over there. They were playing the rags, the real rags that we play now, maple leaf rag and all of that. And they had a very good band. And they wanted to hear us play. We brought the instruments along. We was on the road then, you know, this tour in the country. So we got up there. we had about an 8-piece band, you know. We played a rag, and then we played some swell rag that wasn't in the books, you know. And the fellas all enjoyed it, you know. Then they wanted to hear the blues, and I had a little brown derby I used to use on the blues. Then we started playing the blues, you know, and everything. I told them come down, you know. They got quiet, you know, got way down. I come as the fan and the trumpet with that little brown derby, you see, putting all kind of stuff in there, you know, growling and everything. I made it low down as I could make it, you know, and after a while somebody hit the policeman. And down the here come the wagon, about 11 wagons, putting everybody in jail. And I come down the step and was looking so furious, you know. A fella looked and said, what's the matter, this little big-eyed fella, you know, and said, stand up there, you know. I said, I thought he was going to arrest me. He said, oh, it's a band. I said, yeah, the rest of the fellas come and say, hey, y'all get on out the way and go ahead, because we'll have to put you in too, you know. So we had got a room right at the station, and we was going to pay for the room, you know, and going to come back there after the dance and sleep, catch the morning train out. But we caught a train before morning that morning. We went right on back and got our grips and caught that train that night and went to Pine Bluff. We done the same thing there. We played in a park in Pine Bluff 2 nights after we got over there. That's in Arkansas too, you know. And everything went on all right until we played the blues. They broke the dance up. People was fighting, they had razors and everything else. I had to run, get under some tree. I said, I ain't gonna play the blues no more, but I did. I play them, but something happened all the time. I just said, that's the evil spirit of music. It's not good music, not to me.
That was the 5th of August, 1960, when Paul interviewed Charles Love. And now let's hear from blind Arvella Gray in Maxwell Street in Chicago, and hear what he have to say about black cultural life from his experience.
I learned how to peddle dope in all forms, and I have used it to certain degrees, but I mean, I just, didn't get a habit, but I did use some of it. I got selling moonshine in them days and on the side and gambling, running my gambling joint. And I was a pretty good talker and a pretty good mixer because I came from the South and I know how to say yes sir, no sir, and get next to my superior, which is white people, you know, and they, just went along with my jive. I mean, I just knowed how to jive them, and they let me got away with a whole lot of stuff that I wouldn't if I'd have been a little hostile towards them. In the meantime, I had done whooped my boss on the job, which was a white fella. I had done whooped him around a little bit, and I was just a guy who likes to fight and just a roughneck all the way around. I got argument over this Ardella Miles with a fellow by the name Lamar Kilgo. And he said, I wouldn't fight you, but I'd shoot you rather than fight with you. And so then 2 weeks later, he did shoot me on the 13th day of September 1930, and that's where I got blind.
Then when I think of blind Arvella Gray's experience being a roughneck, is what he called himself, right? He, that is like profound when he say he can tell you the date and the year when he got shot and he lost his sight. I'm like, whoa. Now this guy like playing a guitar and has a cup attached to his lapel of his suit jacket, and while he's playing the guitar, just great skill being demonstrated there, because the way he plays the guitar.
We're going to have a demonstration.
I'm going to have to do this because we're going to play another recording by him. Okay. And I think that you need to see this so that you can see what it is that you're going to be hearing. Because he has this way where he's going to be playing when he talks about John Henry, the steel driving man. He got this thing what we call spanking the guitar, where you spank it like that. that kind of thing. So that's what you're going to be hearing in this next recording. I thought to bring my old metal battered guitar out like Blind the Gray, so you can.
You're honoring him there.
Yeah, I'm honoring him. That's a good way of putting it.
Now, this song is a song I used to use on the railroad when I was lane track, when I was called a gander dancer. We used to sing this as we drove steel. Driving steel mean putting spikes in railroad ties to hold the track steady and like that. And then we also used it when we was lining up the tracks. And we used to have a song like that about lining up the track. He said, oh, working on the railroad, I'm hammering steel. Oh, hotter the sunshine, well, the weather I feel. Working on the railroad, hammering steel. Well, hotter the sunshine, Lord, the better I feel. There, I got a letter from a Hagen town. Said East St. Louis is burning down. Working on the railroad, hammering steel. Well, hotter the sunshine, Lord, the better I feel. Now I'm gonna play John Henry the Steel Driver Man, but we used several different songs, and one of them was a song about, we said, well, you got your pistol, and I got mine. Said, rap on your cottage, partner, if you don't mind dying. You got your pistol, and I got mine. Rap on your cottage, partner, if you don't mind dying. And then the boss would get kind of nervous when we don't have the track line it up and right for the train when the fast train coming along, and said, and he used to pull out his watch. In them days, he used a watch they call a Waterbury, them dollar watches. And he said, we sung a little verse too. It said, oh, Captain got a Waterbury, and it's just like mine. Say the boat's still running, Lord, they won't keep time. Captain got a Waterbury, and it's just like mine. They both still running, Lord, and they won't keep time. Now John Henry. Lord, Lord, Henry was a railroad man. Well, the foreman said to John Henry, he says, what can you do? I can line a track and carry a jack. I can pick and shovel too. Lord, Lord, pick and shovel too. Now John Henry said to the foreman, says a man ain't nothing but a man. I die with the hammer in my hand, Lord, Lord, die with the hammer in my hand. John Henry was a steel driving man, Lord, Lord, and Henry was a railroad man. Now John Henry hammered in the mountain.
And when you think about Blind Gray, I have these jokes that I have with Paul. I mean, it was an ongoing thing. I'd often go over his house, and Blind Gray would always talk about his life and the experience he had, and etc. He called himself a roughneck, and Paul found that really interesting. But then he talked about this Waterbury watch, which was like a dime store watch, and he said right after the interview, he went to one of these Salvation Army thrift shop places, and there was a Waterbury clock. And he said, I just had to have it. So he bought it, and he had to ship back to Britain. So it was always in his kitchen. It never worked, and it never kept the time. So every time I walk into Paul's kitchen, I used to always go, oh, boss got a Waterbury, and just like mine, it don't keep time. So it was a running joke between us, and it always put a smile on our face when we talked about it, because you hear that in the recording, and it's just a fascinating subject. Because think about it now. here is a picture. It's wonderful, the images that you'll find in here. We'll put some of the images, we'll superimpose it on the screen so that people can see, because you have some photographs that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, just I think one of the fascinating aspects of the book is the photographs.
This is Daddy's Stovepipe. This guy recorded in the early 20s, and he was playing on Maxwell Street.
Mm-hmm.
He was 90 years old. He's 91 years old.
Yeah.
So for Paul, that was fascinating to meet someone in 1960 that was busking in the streets at 90 years old.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so there are obviously the trip and the book that comes out are really interesting because of the interviews, and you hear authentically people talking about their experiences, about their ideas, about their opinions, and that's what he wanted to do. But the photographs are another window, a fascinating window into his trip and the world that he was looking for. And I think there's over 80 photographs in the book, which are worthy of note. And I've mentioned, you see sharecroppers' shacks, lumber yards, people busking. They kind of showed the harsh conditions which he was trying to depict, and the fact that many of the people he interviews and speaks to are quite elderly. And one photo in particular always strikes me, and that's this image here of Bo Carter. So Bo Carter obviously was a very successful musician in the 20s and 30s.
He recorded over 150 titles.
Yeah.
And one of the songs, when I started playing the music, going back in the early 80s, back in DC, I was known for playing Bo Carter songs because his songs are a bit smutty. He didn't swear or anything like that, but they were
double entendres.
Double entendres, it's a polite way of putting it. He had songs that would say, I'm a lemon squeezing daddy. You can read into what you want. Biscuit blues, don't put no more baking powder in your bread, you see. Cause your biscuits plenty big enough for me. And the other one was, baby, let me put my banana in your fruit basket. And I tease people with it because I was saying, they are smutty songs, but they're very cleverly scripted as poetry. Yeah. And then when you look at the guitar skills, the technical proficiency that's needed to be able to play it, you got to play. You got to know what you're doing. You got to understand music. These guys were sophisticated.
That's right. And I think I think he was really successful with the Mississippi Shakes as well. And but this image,
Sitting on Top of the World was their big hit.
That's right.
I'm sitting on top of the world.
Yeah. But in this image, what this image kind of communicates is that you always see him holding up the guitar, kind of looking away from it. And I think he was kind of quite elderly. I think he was suffering with diabetes.
And he was blind. He's blind as well.
So and even in the caption, Paul wrote, he turns away from the guitar as if not to play it anymore. He's become sick and blind and he can't play it anymore. Yeah. And while it's a beautiful photograph, it kind of is suggestive of I think that one of the things that Oliver was doing was trying to capture as much as possible about this music before it was too late, from the people who had a real influence in shaping what the music was, in being recording artists, and because there was a sense that this music was fading away, that it was almost of another time, that what was happening now, these were the last days very much. As I said, a lot of the people he speaks to, you mentioned Daddy Stovepipe in his 90s, Blind Arvella Gray, these are people who had lived a significant life and had gone through a lot. But interesting, if we think about when the book comes out, 1965, he goes on his trip in 1960, before the blues boom or the British invasion or whatever you want to call it. But when the book comes out 5 years later, in 1965, and within that period we've had groups white groups reinterpreting songs of you've got the Rolling Stones recording Little Red Rooster and playing it on TV. You've got the discoveries or the rediscoveries, and I do that with inverted commas, of people like Mississippi John Hurt and Son House in 1962 and 63, and these guys are taken around college circuits playing to white kids. So it's a very different world in which the book comes out, in which the blues is kind of popular and in vogue. And the book for me is almost like saying, hold on a second, this is the real thing. This is where it comes from. Let's not turn away. I mean, you see images in the book of the south side of Chicago, of these kind of very run-down, overcrowded housing blocks, which are very a world away from the idea that, you know, of the pop world, you know, of the success of young white artists
on TV.
That's right.
Can you imagine, as a black person? Let me just say this though: as a black person in the early '60s, when there was anybody black on television, lights off, you better be quiet, you watch television. Even if they were playing the stereotypical Andy Step and Fetch It kind of role, whatever it was, you had to see it because somebody black on television. It just didn't happen. It was very rare. And so to think that back in the '60s that they were on television playing this music, but I have to give them credit. They did introduce to the world the black artists.
Yeah, totally. I think that there is obviously that debate about cultural appropriation and the fact that a lot of white people got rich, whereas these guys got nothing. And I think one of the things when the trip was being organised is that Oliver wanted to make sure that he paid everybody for their recordings. You know, he was very careful not to want to exploit the people he was meeting.
Look, I mean, I have this program called Blues Week, and I've been running for 21 years where we teach. And Paul attended every year and always gave a talk, and he was very receptive to the idea, and he thought it was great. I just like to say that since living here, I did some shows with David Graham, wonderful, great guitar player, is no longer with us. He's a British player. Bert Yanks, John Renbourn.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm studying this Bert Yanks song called A Woman Like You. And so I want to be allowed to be able to play it. So when I hear the story about whether or not the white man, can he play the blues, anybody can play whatever they want to play. I'm for that. And I want to be able to play a Bert Yanks song, so how dare you deny me? You know, and so I should be allowed that. But Paul was saying that he thought it was important to understand the cultural connection and the chapter here. I want to just read this. Okay. I think it's really interesting. It kind of forms what you're saying to the book and the subject. It is nevertheless a picture that has been impaired by the extensive imitation and dilution of the blues idioms that the 1960s brought. Worldwide recognition of the blues also meant widespread copying of the music, and student groups in Liverpool and London played rhythm and blues and R&B clubs, while their counterparts in the United States, the student white blues singers, were acclaimed in the city folk song clubs. Well-intentioned though their efforts, well played and sung though their performances were, theirs was essentially a derivative, eclectic music. Its prevalence brought much confusion and led to considerable misunderstanding of the blues and inadvertently sped its death.
Yeah, I mean, and he's reflecting on that for the reissue, isn't he? He's like in the 90s. I think it's a bit of a hornet's nest in many senses. I think what we can certainly focus on is whatever your view may be on that, and that might be another subject for another podcast. I think is that I think that what we see when people look at this book and interpret the trip, that there is a very, in many senses, Oliver was a folklorist. He wanted to capture and preserve what he found. And in doing so, when you have to conserve something, you inadvertently create its boundaries or try to define what it is and what it isn't. But often, if you hear some of the interviews, what's fascinating about it is that a lot of the singers would disagree with each other on what the blues was and what it meant.
That's so true.
So there is, I think, one of the great things about Conversation with the Blues is, even though I studying Paul's work for many years, I get a broad sense of how he understands the music and the culture which it came from. It also is very clear and apparent that between the musicians themselves, there's a huge broad range of what it is and what it means to different people. And I think that's something to be embraced and appreciated. So we don't have to wrestle over the borders so much. But
well, that's true. But when I hear stories when people talk about how they playing like Chicago blues, I'm like, Chicago blues? What are you talking about? Big Bill Broomsey? Because that was like Chicago blues. Because in Paul's book, Conversation with the Blues, he interviewed Muddy Waters, and Muddy Waters says that Big Bill had been around for a long time in Chicago when I come up in 43. So he helped me to get my start. So they forgot all about Bill Broomsey.
that's true.
He recorded hundreds of tracks starting from 1927.
Yeah. And Broomsey is a fascinating figure, also because I think he has a big influence on Oliver. No, but not only him. I think in the 1950s he was the one of the main movers.
Let's play one more. I have to play this one because this one gives me goosebumps.
Let's go.
This is Little Brother Montgomery. Now, he recorded this song originally in 1930. Now, this is in 1960, and Paul, I would have loved to have seen Paul's face when he was playing the Vicksburg Blues. And it's interesting because he talks about this piano style, the style that he plays, this left hand go broom, 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 broom. So he's playing these arpeggios with his left hand. And I get goosebumps every time they move. I go, oh, it's wonderful to listen to it. And it's a style that he calls barrel house. And barrel being that, they get some barrels, and they would have 3 barrels, and then they have a wooden plank over top of it, and that's where they would serve the drinks. That's where the term barrel house come from. And he was saying that in these really rough places where, they used to play, and how he was the first to play in this style, and then Roosevelt Sykes recorded before him the 44 blues, and then Roosevelt Sykes got credited with it before Little Brother, but Little Brother said, no. I learned it before that, and I was playing it before that. It's just that Sykes got to the studio before me, that kind of thing. But here is the 44 Blues, also known by brother, Little Brother, my brother, as Vicksburg Blues.
I come up to Tallulah, Louisiana, and then in 1922 high water ran us out of Louisiana. So I come over to Vicksburg, and I played there, and we originated numbers like Vicksburg Blues, 44 Blues. It's the same thing. It's a blues. It's a bell house, honky-tonk blues. People dance by it, did the shimmy by that. It's a blues we just steady made up. You could keep adding to it, These are the first Vicksburg Blues I made. I got the Vicksburg Blues and I sing 'em anywhere I go. I got the Vicksburg Blues and I sing 'em anywhere I go. Now the reason why I sing 'em, my babe said she didn't want me no more. I got the Vicksburg Blues and I'll sing 'em anywhere I please. I got the Vicksburg Blues and I'll sing 'em anywhere I please. Now the reason I sing 'em to give my poor heart some ease. be your low down dog no more. I don't like this someplace, mama. Lord, and I ain't never will. Now I don't like this someplace, mama. Lord, and I ain't never will. 'Cause I can sit right here, look at Big Spray on the hill. I taught him to a guy named Lee Green in Sunhammer, Louisiana. And on later years, then he taught him to Roosevelt. So they beat me to Chicago and put him out.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff to hear that. Kind of reminds me of how going to the US, Paul was actually following the footsteps of many people who in previous generations had visited the American South or the United States to record, even as you say, like old English ballads and Scottish ballads, and how they filter through somehow. So that's fascinating stuff. I'm just reminded of we mentioned Richard Wright, who became friends with Paul in the 50s and who contributed the foreword to Blues Fell This Morning, a very famous one where he says, you know, people ask the question, is a British man, an outsider, able or capable of, you know, adequately interpreting this culture to which they are alien? I'm paraphrasing there very badly, but more or less the gist is, you know, can an outsider fully appreciate and understand something if they're alien to it? And in subsequent years, many people would criticize people like Paul for trying to do it. What do you think about that? I mean, Richard Wright was very saying, yes, you know, someone like Oliver is far enough removed from the kind of broiling racial politics of the United States to be able to give them a clearer-eyed assessment or interpret them without all that kind of stuff in the way. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting you said it because I read what was in the book as well. And let me add this. Richard Wright said to Paul, Dr. Martin Luther King read his book.
Oh, that's right. I remember that. Yeah.
That's in there as well because he showed it to Martin Luther King. And so, well, talking about that, in the early 80s, I met this English girl that worked for the embassy in D.C. Now, no, 1990. Sorry, I met in 1990. So now I'm gigging around D.C. doing my smutty songs, right, having a bit of fun, right? And what I found interesting was to see her reaction to what was happening in the audience. She said, "This is really fascinating." I went, "What do you mean?" "Well, you got the black table over here, then you got the white table over here. And while you were singing, you had your response, call and response that was happening with the black table. And they would go, 'Oh, I hear you. Oh, I hear you. I know what you're talking about.'" They were making these little comments. She said, that reminded me of what she was taught back here in England about, you know, that being an amen corner. You know, I was preaching to the choir because there was this interaction between me and the black table. And then I was making a joke. And when I made the joke, the black table laughed. Then the white table looked over at the black table as if like, what we're missing. So she was pointing all these things out that I couldn't see. I didn't pick any of this up. So I'm like, so then when she started identifying it, then I started seeing it myself, and I'm like, oh, okay, I never saw that. So she had this kind of objective, you know, outsider view that as an insider you can't see. And so this is what Paul brought, I think, to the situation that Richard Wright thought that he should go to the States as well.
Yeah.
Make you a field trip. Go see if what you wrote about in Blues Fell This Morning is true, that he found is more than true. And then took that experience, brought it back, wrote the conversation with the book, comes out in 1965. Then he meets me, 1995.
Yeah.
We then set up the European Blues Association, incorporating the Archive of African American Music so that the conversation continues.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm so grateful that you came so that we can have this discussion.
It's been great fun.
Yes.
Great fun.
All right.